Hi students, today we will continue our lectures on cryptographic tools. And before we dive into the content of new primitives, I would like to recap what we have learned in previous lectures. And as you can see from the iPad screen, so we have different cryptographic primitives which provides several security attributes, or sometimes people say it's security services. And on the left-hand side, I listed the primitives. So we have encryption, hash functions, message authentication codes, and digital signatures. And on the right-hand side, we have the attributes that are provided by these primitives. So we know that encryption provides confidentiality, and for hash functions, it's mostly used to provide integrity. And for authentication codes, it provides integrity and authenticity. For digital signatures, it provides integrity, authenticity, and non-repudiation, which is one aspect of accountability. So we have introduced encryptions, and we will learn hash functions, message authentication codes, and digital signatures in today's lecture. Before we start our introduction of the last three primitives, let's recap what we have learned from symmetric encryptions. So we can symmetric cryptography. So first, let's look at block ciphers, which are widely used in many applications, especially in the internet. Okay. And we have introduced the basic mode of block ciphers. In fact, that's the encryption of single block. And we have encryption algorithm, and we have a key and another input, plain text. I used P here. And this algorithm outputs the ciphertext. I dilute it as a C here. This is encryption process. When it comes to the decryption process, it's like reverse operation. So we have decryption algorithm, and the input is C together with the key, which is the same as the encryption key, and it will produce the original plain text. So this is the mode of encryption and decryption of one single block. And we introduced the design idea of modern block ciphers. So let's take a closer look at this model. In fact, this process can be expanded as we have several round functions, R1 and R2, and Rn. And these round functions are relatively weak, but the combine of them can be quite secure after several rounds. Now in this case, we have the input, the original plain text, and for the round function 1, we have a round key. We denote it as a key K1. And the output will be input to the second round function. And here we have another round key, that's a K2. And then the output goes into the third round with the key K3, so on and so forth, until the last round we have the round key Kn, and the last round outputs the ciphertext C. And these round functions K1, K2 till Kn, they are different. And in fact, they are generated from the original encryption key K here. So this is a little bit more introduction of the internal round functions of block ciphers. And for decryption, the process is quite similar, but it's reversed. I mean, we have this round function Rn, but here we have C, the input, to be able to decrypt the ciphertext C, then we need the inverse of round function Rn. I did it as inverse here. And here we need the same key for the last round, Kn. And the output will be the input of the previous round. And to make it clear, we use the same notation here. We have the second round, and we have the first round. But to be able to recover the original plain text, here we need to have the inverse of round function R2 and inverse of round function R1. And we need the same round key K2 and K1. The output of inverse round function will be the input of inverse of R1. Then it finally gives out the original plain text. So here we have again this key. It's used to generate all these round functions. So let's move this part a little bit lower. So we have this encryption process and decryption process. So this is how block cipher encrypt a single block P here. And how the block cipher encrypt several blocks when the original data is much larger than a single block. But then we need to consider encryption of multiple blocks. In this case, we have several blocks, and we denote it as P1, P2, until PT. Here, the last block could be not complete. Then we can add some paddings to fill in the incomplete block to create a whole block. And for each of this block, we can have the similar process, encryption, and we have input the key, that's encryption key. So it outputs ciphertext, we denote it as C1. And this process can be repeated for each block. So I copied it. And then here we have P2, excuse me, we have ciphertext C2 for the second block. We have ciphertext CT for the last block. And here the encryption can be any block cipher. It could be DES, which is not necessarily secure enough. It could be AES with 128-bit key, or even AES with 256-bit key. So the encryption here, it's a generic term to indicate the block cipher. Now in this case, of course, we can encrypt these blocks separately. So P1, P2, and PT, all of these blocks are encrypted separately. And let's look at what might be the feature or weakness of this process. And in fact, as you see here from the figure, all the keys for different block encryptions are the same. And if we have blocks P1 and P2, they are the same, then the ciphertext C1 will be exactly the same as C2. Right, so we have C1 weakness. C1 equals C2 if P1 equals P2. Well, it's not necessarily very bad weakness, but we want to avoid this feature or this pattern. The reason is that for some type of original data, it could be that several blocks are exactly the same. For example, if we have taken a picture of the sea of the sky, then for many pixels, the color of the pixel are the same. Then if we use this simple separate encryption for each block, and the output will have some pattern. Let me show you the figure, like electronic. We can search for mode of operation block cipher. And here, this is a widely used figure. So if we have a figure, like an image here as an input, as you can see, there are many areas are white, except for this cute penguin. And if we use the previous process, which is so-called ECB mode, electronic codebook mode, so each block is encrypted separately, then the final ciphertext of this image will be like this. Although for each block itself, it might be quite strong, but as a user, you won't be satisfied with this encryption because it tells you a lot of information of the plaintext of the original image, right? And to avoid this type of vulnerabilities, there are several modes of block ciphers. Like we prefer the encrypted image is like the rightmost one. And you cannot tell anything out of this image. It's a kind of just a random generated image. And we have for several modes of it. One is called cipher block chain, the CBC mode. And also we have for cipher feedback chain, a cipher feedback mode, and output feedback mode, and the CTR mode. These extra 4 modes of operations on block ciphers. And for each of them, it has a little bit subtle difference. But the idea is to introduce another input in the encryption process. Let's go back to the iPad screen. So in this case, if we add some extra input in each block, and if these input are different from each other, then even the input plaintext are the same for 2 blocks or for all the blocks, the ciphertext will be totally different. That's the idea. Here, if we add some extra information, we'll write as a vector, extra information. And here we add extra information, a vector. We add X information for each block. Here you note that if these extra informations are the same, then it does not increase, it does not change the situation at all, right? We need to make them different. And how can we have different, this extra input? One idea is to use the output of a previous block to the next block. So here we can use the output of first block, like C1, as input, this vector, to the second block, and use the output of the second block to the third block. And we can repeat this idea. Now here we should change it as here. It's not vector. It's okay. This is Cn minus 1. And here is C1. Here is C2. And how can we get the extra vector for the first block? Well, there's no previous block, so we define a vector. We call it initialization vector, shortly for IV. And since from previous, the single mode, we have input this plain text, and the input has fixed block size, right? And it's natural to have, and it has to have, for each of this block encryption, it takes the same size of the block, the input block. It gives out an output block. And so it's quite natural to take the XOR of the P1 and the initial vector, which has the same size or smaller size than P1, and XOR with P1. We use it as the input. Well, it's and for the second block, and again we have XORed for the plain text P2 and C1. Here it's the same. Here we have XORed PT. That's XORed of Cn minus 1. Excuse me, CT minus 1 with PT. Use it as the input of the last block. This is one way, and it's called the cipher chain CBC mode, cipher block chain mode. CBC mode. Okay, that's the idea of using block ciphers to encrypt large data sets, like encrypting multiple blocks. And then we can recap what we have learned from last lecture on hash functions. For hash functions, it takes some input and gives out an output, and the input has a variable length. It's variable size, and the output has a fixed size. We have the operation is a hash. Normally the output is denoted by lowercase h. Hash equals hash. M. And for security, we would like the hash functions to satisfy 3 properties. Security requirements. This is important for cryptographic applications. One is called pre-image property, pre-image resistant property. Also called one-way property. So to calculate the hash of the message is quite easy, but given the hash, to calculate its original input is difficult. That's what one-way means. And they have another 2 resistant property, weak collision resistant. And strong collision resistant. And for here, I can write if we are given a hash of M. To find the hash, it's difficult. And for the weak collision resistant, by collision, it means there are 2 different inputs which gives out the same output. So the weak collision is given X it's difficult to find another Y such that HY equals, excuse me, H and the hash of Y equals hash of X. And strong collision resistant means it's difficult to find X, Y such that hash of X equals hash of Y. So we have mentioned these security requirements of hash functions. Now I want to introduce you some applications of hash functions. The first application is to protect integrity of some data or some softwares. Some of you may be aware that in some web pages, if they provide some software for downloading, and normally there will be a hash next to the download link. The purpose is to enable the user to check the integrity of the software. And the user can download the software, then calculate its hash. And in most of cases, use MD5, or some cases use SHA-1. And the user can calculate either MD5 or SHA-1 of the software and compare its output with the ones provided in the web page. If they match, then the user can be sure that the software hasn't been modified by other one, especially by some malicious attackers. This is the first application. And the second application is to protect the password of users. And in fact, it's used to store users' password in database. And we will introduce this part in user authentication in Friday's lecture. And the third application is to generate keys used for encryption or used for message authentication codes. And the fourth application is to speed up the process of digital signatures. Digital signature is one important functionality provided by public key cryptographic primitives. And by using hash functions, the process can be sped up because most public key cryptography algorithms are much slower than symmetric cryptography. So it's necessary to use hash functions to improve the performance of digital signatures. So we will learn it afterwards. So now let's take a look at the general design of hash functions and the specific examples. Here I want to give you, again, a very brief idea of the design of hash functions. Otherwise, it's too abstract and you don't get the idea. So suppose we have input, like it's called a message. And in this example, we divide this message into n blocks. If the last block is not it has less than 512 bits, then we add some paddings. Here, normally you have there's a padding strategy. Like if the first bit is 1 and then followed by all zeros, and then also give some information of the total length. Like to make it simple, we assume the message has exactly n blocks. And here we have a function called compressor function. By compress, it means it takes input here 256 bits IV, again, initialization vector, and the message block, which has 512 bits. So it takes these two as input, and it outputs 256 bits. So that's where this compression function comes from. It compress input, gives you the output. And since we want to take the whole message as input of the hash function, then we need to repeat this process if it has several blocks. Then the second block goes to the same compress function, and here the output of the first block goes into the second block, and so on and so forth. So till the last block, you have the input from the previous block and another input from the message. Then it compresses the input and gives the final hash, which is 256 bits. This is how hash functions is designed. It's in SHA-1, SHA-2, and in SHA-3, this new family, they use different construction. I heard some noise. I need to close my window. Tobias, that's a good question. And the reason I introduced the round function is to give you this comparison between hash functions and the ciphers. And for block ciphers, we also have this similar, like this IV and then this plain text give you cipher text. If you consider this C as an encryption function or encryption algorithm, then the structure is very similar, right? But on here for ciphers for encryptions, this encryption can be reversed. It means if we have the input and gives output, then we can also find the inverse of this operation, which takes this input and some other input, then it gives the original output. So this is a difference. And also for hash functions, you see, we only care about the last output. And for encryption, we need all the ciphertext for each block. So in fact, for hash functions and block cipher, they have some similarities in their structure, but the functionalities of them are quite different. I see another question from Ahmed. So the first compressed function becomes the IV of the second one. Yes. Here the output of the first compressed function will be the input of the second compressed function, and so on and so forth. So this is the way to kind of connect different blocks together to have them correlated. That's the idea. When is a hash function used? Hash functions have many applications, and we will go back to this this question later. And here, as you see from the text, the original message is divided into n blocks, and each of them it has this this C is this C, the compression function or compressed function. It takes mi and hi minus 1 as input, and for here it's I shouldn't use this one. I should use the later term directly, because in for different hash functions they have different structure. I should use the description of the hash functions exactly same as it's a figure. Then it will not have any confusion. So just ignore this part. Now let's come back to Daniel's question, where hash function is used. Hash function can be used for one integrity, that if I guess some of you who have heard of hash function is because like if you download some softwares from some websites, then they provide some hash of that software. And the purpose is to make sure that if you download the software, you want to check whether it is modified or not, then you can use hash function to compute the hash of the software. If the hash of the software is the same as the hash provided in the web page, then it means okay, the software hasn't been modified by anyone. this is one purpose. So in this purpose, we use hash function to ensure the integrity of a software. And another important usage is to protect our password. And we will introduce this in user authentication in next lecture. So I will not introduce too much about this password protection by hash function. Another important usage of hash functions is called digital signature. And this is a part of public key cryptography. And we will use it later on. For you to know, hash functions have many algorithms. And here I took a screenshot of Wikipedia, and you can find it at Wikipedia. I just give you some information of what are the cryptography hash functions used in practice. And today, most of applications use SHA-2 for decent security. And the SHA-3 can be used can be found in some applications, but it's relatively new, and many vendors and companies haven't deployed SHA-3 in their products. Is there any more question about hash function? Okay, let's continue. Now we came to what does collision found. Okay, collision found, it means if we have a hash function, and we hope that it's difficult to find two different inputs that have same hash. And this collision found, it means you find two different inputs with same hash. That's a collision. Then we say collision found. Any more question about hash functions? Okay. So now let's come to the next part. That's for authentication. And we mentioned for authentication, it requires both integrity and authenticity. Here, let's look at the authenticity part. In fact, for authentication, it can be provided by both symmetric key encryptions and message authentication codes. And for symmetric encryptions, let's look at this. So if an entity receives a ciphertext, and then it can, he or she can successfully decrypt with the shared key with the sender, like Alice. So Bob receives a ciphertext from Alice, and he has a pre-shared key with Alice. So if Bob can decrypt the ciphertext with a shared key, and he can recognize that's some original message, and it's like readable. It makes sense to Bob. Then Bob believes that, okay, this message, the ciphertext, was sent from Alice, because only Alice has the pre-shared key, and there's no other party can send the ciphertext, which can be decrypted by the shared key KAB here, that gives a sensible output. So this is the idea of using symmetric key to provide authentication. Yes, you can find many hash functions in the explanation. Yeah. And here, the second part is by using message authentication codes. And this message authentication code, if the receiver receives a message with attached code, attached MAC or a MAC tag, and based on verification process, the receiver can be sure the message has not been modified and can be assured it is originally sent from the intended sender. That's the idea of a message authentication code. Let's take a look at it. So the idea is to design a function or an algorithm that it takes a message and a key. This key is pre-shared with the recipient. And it gives the output, we call it the MAC or MAC tag. So it has another term called cryptographic checksum. And in this case, this MAC, it has several bits. It's not necessarily the same as original message. It can be much shorter than the original input. And because here we use this key, which is pre-shared with the recipient, then MAC function sometimes is also called keyed functions, because if you replace F by hash here and add extra input key here, then it works like a keyed hash function. And the process, it's quite similar as encryption use, because you have this key and you have the input, and it gives you some output.
Oh, yeah.
And if you look at the model, this simple model, it's quite similar as encryption. But message authentication code, what happened? Okay, I will mute all. I think now it's fine, yeah. Okay. So this is the general mode of using a message authentication code. Suppose we have two communication parties, like Alice and Bob. So Alice take a message M, and this message is input to a message authentication algorithm with a secret key. It gives output. It's called the MAC tag. Then this tag is appended to the original message, then sent to Bob. When Bob receives this message and tag, so what Bob tries to do is to verify whether the message has been modified in the communication channel, like in the internet, and also whether this message was sent from Alice, who shared the key with Bob before. Then what Bob can do is Bob takes this message M and put into same MAC message authentication algorithm with another the input key. This key is pre-shared with Alice, the sender. Then compute its output. It gives a tag. We say it's another output, and then compare this output with the tag here, which Bob receives. If they are the same, then Bob can be sure, okay, this message hasn't been modified in the communication channel. And because the key is only shared with Alice, so Bob can be sure this message was sent from Alice, not from anyone else. So in this way, this message authentication code provides the integrity of the message M and also the authenticity, the origin of this message, where it is sent from. That's the idea and the model of a message authentication codes. I see I have passed the break time. And do you need a break? Okay, 5 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Let's have. We can start at 3:15. See you later. So we have introduced the model of message authentication codes, and there are several MAC algorithms and also standard used. And by message authentication code, its original meaning is to authenticate the message content and also the message integrity and also the message origin. So it can be used as some block ciphers to design message authentication code. And in early days, 1990s, it used this data authentication algorithm based on DS. But because DS has a quite short key size, and it's not secure to use this algorithm in today's applications. And then later several algorithms have been designed. And to make it simpler, we will only look at HMAC. This HMAC is standing for hash-based MAC. So the algorithm is designed based on cryptographic hash functions, which are secure. The reason of using hash functions is because there are many strong algorithms there, and it was used in some applications, and maybe for the different purpose, have hash functions already used in the communications. And also the security of hash functions have been well studied. Due to this reason, so it's quite natural and quite attractive to use hash functions for message authentication code. Let's look at, that's also why we mentioned MAC sometimes is also called the keyed hash. And how can we embed some secret key in hash functions to design message authentication code that is secure? Well, in fact, it's not that obvious. Some naive ways have been proven to be insecure. Let's only look at one example, which is I cannot say it's proven to be secure, but so far there's no attack have been found to HMAC. And here this H, it can be used. It can use different hash functions. I mean, it can use SHA-1. If SHA-1 is not secure at the moment, then we can replace it by more secure hash functions like SHA-2. If in 30, 40 years, SHA-2 families are not secure anymore, then we can replace it by SHA-3 or even SHA-4 if we have this later on. So let's look at the workflow of HMAC. So it takes this key as input, and it takes another two vectors called internal pad and external pad. So shortly IPad and OPad. And let's look at this internal pad first. This internal pad has 64 bytes, so it's quite long. And normally the key of HMAC is like 128 bits or 256 bits. And so this key is XORed with this internal pad. It gives an internal keypad. So it's 64 bytes. And it's added in front of the message, this M here. Then this message will be input to a hash function. Here, this hash sum, and we use SHA-1 in this example. Then it gives a hash sum1. And this hash sum1 will be appended to this alter keypad. And this alter keypad, it's a similar process. We have the original key, and we have this alter pad, and the XOR of them is alter keypad. And this alter keypad is appended, it's added in front of this hash sum. That's the output of the previous one. Then based on a hash function, here we again use the SHA-1. It's quite natural because we just repeat this process, right? And then it gives the output SHA hash sum2. For this SHA-1, because the output has 160 bits, so then it's 20 bytes. That's how HMAC works with the SHA-1. There are some other type of revisions of HMAC. This one is quite neat, and it was used in many applications. Is there any question about HMAC and the idea of using hash functions to design message authentication code? Okay, then I continue. Here I give you a summary of using symmetric cryptography primitives in applications, and also some key parameters and information of them. Because the design and the construction of these primitives are quite similar, because it's like you have a good design, then if you want to provide some extra or some other properties, then you may want to, okay, why do I need to start from scratch to design a new primitive? Why don't I use an existing primitive or the existing design idea and modify it, revise it to achieve my goal? right? That's quite natural to think. So for block ciphers, to be able to decrypt the ciphertext, we need the ciphers to be reversible. We need the decryption algorithm for block ciphers, and the same for stream ciphers, because they are decryptions and encryptions in the place. And of course, they need keys for the input. And here the input and output size I mentioned before, and the difference between block ciphers and the stream ciphers is here. Block ciphers encrypt the data block by block, while stream ciphers encrypt them, we can say, bit by bit. Things in today's CPU, like they are 32 bits or 64 bit, so we can directly encrypt the data with the key stream, like byte by byte or word by word. But here, block size can be 128 bits, and it can be increased to 256 bits. And there are some instances of block ciphers, and we mentioned AES, and here this 3DS I haven't mentioned, but I can say a bit of words on it. For DS, we mentioned its major weakness is the key size. It's too short. It's only 56 bits. As Tobias previously mentioned, if I have one encryption which is not secure enough, then why don't I repeat this encryption, but with a different key, right? So we can have double, like a 2DS. The first DS take 56 bits, the second DS take 56 bits. Then we have 112 bits. So the key size is doubled. But unfortunately, this simple way of repeat the encryption just twice does not really give you 112-bit security. It only gives you 57-bit security because of attack, so-called in-the-middle attack. And to prevent this type of attack, the idea is to use 3 DS. So we have 1 DS encryption, then 1 DS decryption, and then 1 DS encryption. And in this process, for the first DS, we have used key 1, and for the second DS decryption, we use a different key, K2. And for the last DS encryption, we use K1 as the first block, the first DS encryption. Of course, the last key can be used like different. Then we have 3 different keys in 3 DS operations. This is called 3DS, or sometimes you see it's a triple DS. And for message authentication codes, because we only need to compare the tag of a message, and there's no need for the MAC to be reversible. And we need secret information shared between the sender and the receiver. This is the only way to ensure the recipient, the receiver, that, okay, this data, this message was sent from a certain party, not from other parties. Because we mentioned for all the algorithms themselves, they are supposed to learn to everyone. And for MAC, another difference between block ciphers or like encryption algorithms is the input size. They can be variable, and the output size is fixed. And this is same for hash functions. So, And we have introduced the HMAC. For CMAC, it's based on block ciphers, and we don't need to go into CMAC. It will be introduced in 143, the applied cryptography course. And for hash functions, there's no need for hash functions to be reversible. We only need to calculate the hash of some input. So that's why it's called the message digest, because the input of the hash can be very big, while the output of hash is fixed. We have several families. This SHA stands for Secure Hash Algorithms. We have 3 families in practice. And the common features of all these symmetric cryptography primitives are they mostly use iterative operations on the input. And for the first 3, because the key is needed in these operations, so the key was taken into as an input in some way. And for all of them to be secure, then the output should look like a random binary string. Each of them. When we talk about whether a primitive is secure enough, one basic requirement is that the output of these primitives cannot be distinguishable from binary strings. So that's the basic requirement of cryptographic primitives. Another advantage of using this basic requirement on cryptographic primitives is such a feature can enable us to design extra or some new primitives based on existing secure primitives. It's like HMAC. If we have secure enough hash functions, then we can use it, and based by some simple operations and modifications, then we can use secure hash functions to design secure MAC authentication, this MAC algorithm. That's the idea. Before I continue, is there any question about symmetric cryptographic primitives? Now you are quite silent. I'm not sure whether you are listening to me. Okay, thanks. No question. Okay. And now let's move. Here, I want to know that although in this course and also in later cryptography course, we will introduce the details of some algorithms. But in fact, there are a bunch of them. There are quite a lot of these algorithms because many cryptographers are working on it. And for block ciphers, these are the common algorithms, and people nowadays are mostly focusing on AES because it's a standard and it's used for many companies. They like to use a standard. And these standards normally are studied and analyzed by cryptographers for many years before it can be used in applications. And for stream ciphers, we haven't introduced it. I can skip this. Then for hash functions and the message authentication codes, in the figure, like this diagram I include in the slides, it's a diagram for SHA-2, or it's a general diagram for MD5 and SHA-1 as well. And these hash functions have several usage. Here, one important usage is this called password-based key derivation function. And this algorithm is designed based on the hash functions, and it's used to generate the key for encryption. I got a question, I think, last week about the generation, the key, how we can generate the key for encryption. Well, in practice, the user only needs to input a password, a short password, or even a weak password sometimes. Then this password cannot be directly used as encryption key because it will decrease the security of the key. The key, the ideal encryption key should be random like binary string. So by using hash functions, we can take the user's password and output binary strings, which looks like a random binary string. Then this string will be used as encryption key for block ciphers, or for stream ciphers, or for message authentication codes. Here I got this question from Alexander, but wouldn't using a common cipher is a bad idea? That's a good point. There are two trends. One is to keep cipher algorithms or ciphers secret as well. Well, there's two ways or two fields. Like for cryptography community, we all voting for to keeping all the algorithms public, known to everyone. And the reason why we use common ciphers, as you asked, well, it's not like, okay, an attacker can easily crack a cipher, even it is commonly used, even it is used everywhere. It doesn't necessarily mean it can be cracked more easily. Yeah, yes, Heckman's point is very good. Another thing is, as I mentioned, for most of the cipher standards, they are analyzed by specialists, by intelligent cryptographers, by many mathematicians. And if all of them cannot find any weakness or vulnerabilities of the cipher, then people who are like engineers or just end users or hackers, they are not, we can say it's less likely that they can find weakness in the ciphers too. Who has authority? You vote for stuff like that? And it's like a common knowledge that we have in cryptographic community or in many textbooks. There's one principle called Kudrow's principle. He was I'm not sure whether an authority or a researcher in 19th century, and he proposed that this is a good principle for cryptography. I mean, if we can assume different knowledge level for the attackers. One is we keep the algorithm hidden, like secret. Then in this case, you may think, yes, you may assume, and the attacker has less knowledge of the cipher, it would be more difficult for attackers to attack the cipher, right? It's a one statement, and it's arguable, because if you think, okay, if we make the algorithms known to the public, everyone knows it. But even with this type of extra knowledge, attackers cannot attack it, cannot find any vulnerability of it. Isn't it would it be better than the other option? And you assume attackers are not knowing the cipher. And in this case, the designer may, there might be some hidden vulnerabilities of the algorithm that the designer assume, okay, since the attacker do not know the algorithm itself, then it should be fine. Then we can use it. So somehow, if you have more public, like more open design, and to everyone, to the public, then somehow you assume more knowledge of the attacker, and if still in this case attacker cannot crack it, isn't it better? Does that make sense? Yeah, and because in fact it can find many examples in applications which assume, or like which tries to hide the algorithms, and most of them have been cracked. That's you can find a lot of these examples in the internet. Okay, let's look at here. Here I give you this the figure of password-based key derivation function. And here, this PRF, you can consider it as a hash function. And the purpose of this function is to generate strong key or secure key for block ciphers, for method authentication codes. And the input from the user is a password. And here's another input called sort. You can interpret it as initial vector. And also, you can specify the number of iterations here. You can, normally if you iterate more times, you may get a higher security, but there will be a limit that, okay, after certain times, even you increase the iterations, it will not increase the security of the function. And the last one is the encryption keyness. This is how it looks like. Here you have this sort and this some integers. Like you can interpret it here as just integer 1, integer 2, or integer length. Of course, it can be an array of integers, and you can take the entry of this array. Then it is like we just need to look at the first row, and the other rows are the same. So we have this input sort and initial integer. And we have the password from the user. Then it is used as input of a hash function, or here it's called PRF, stands for pseudo random function. So it's like a random function output random binary strings. Then the output will be used as the input of the second operation. And this output, all the output of these blocks will be XORed, and it gives you an output T1. Then for the second one, it gives you T2, the third one, and the last one, it gives you T next. Then all of them are concatenated together. This whole string is the encryption key, or is the key used for encryption for message authentication codes. If the attacker loads the MK function, I get this question from Daniel. If the key cannot be more secure than the length of the... I need to think of your question. If the attacker loads the MAC function, and the key can't be more secure than the length of the password. Yeah, you can say so, but this password length is not necessarily fixed. I mean, no, you are not supposed to remember this. I cannot remember this either, so don't worry. And let's go back to Daniel's question as a user, you are free to choose the length of your password, and you are free to choose the combination of your password, right? You can choose small letters, you can choose capital letters, you can choose numbers, you can choose punctuations, you can choose every single key in your keyboard. And in this case, it's not necessarily like the attacker has no idea how the user choose the length of the password and how the user choose the possible letters in the password. Daniel, yes, if you choose a weak password, and if the attacker can guess out your password, then there's no way to prevent attack. That's true. But on the other hand, even you choose a strong password, but if the MAC function is not secure enough, then it doesn't mean your key will be secure, will be strong. Are you with me? I mean, one side is for the user. If the user chooses a very weak password, no matter how strong the algorithm we design, no matter how secure the components we have implemented, we cannot increase the security of the whole system. That's why we say security depends on the weakest link. And in this scenario, the weakest link is the weak password. By weak of the password, yes, but the thing is, if you choose strong enough password, then the attacker cannot brute force it. Alexander, yes, you're right. I mean, the password depends on users. Some users choose weak password, some users choose very strong password. And the attacker cannot assume that a user always chooses a weak password. So we can assume the attacker has no idea of the user's password, right? Since we have some other content in the lecture, so we can have this discussion after the lecture. Daniel, is that okay? Okay. And the usage of this key is to use it to generate secret keys for symmetric. Here, if we use some symmetric cryptography primitives, then there are two parts we need to keep in mind. One is we choose very strong, secure, symmetric primitives, either block ciphers, either message authentication codes. And we need to make sure the implementation of them is proper. Another part is we need to make sure the key used for this encryption or these MAC algorithms are strong enough as well. And this is the part of key generation we just described. And there's some other part like the management of the key and the distribution of the key. That's the difficult part. I remember I got the question from student, how the secret key is shared between two parties in the internet. In fact, that's quite difficult. That's why we need public key cryptography. And here's some history of a public key crypto system. I will skip this due to the time limit. And let's directly go to the bones of public key crypto. And first, I want to give you an overview of public key crypto. Different from symmetric key crypto, it uses a pair of keys. One is a private, the other one is a public key. And the usage of public key crypto system is to share secret key between two parties by encryption. So suppose Alice and Bob are communicating with each other and they want to share some secret information used as a secret key for block ciphers, for AES, for example. And Alice has a pair of keys, Bob has a pair of keys. For secure key exchange, Alice encrypt the secret key with Bob's public key and then send it to Bob. When Bob receives it, Bob will decrypt the cipher text with Bob's private key, and Bob will get the secret information Alice wants to share with them. And here, another type of application is called digital signature. It's a kind of reversed process of key exchange. In digital signatures, the sender sends something by encrypt the file or the input with the sender's private key, like here Alice. So Alice wants to send some file to Bob and want to ensure that the file can be verified by Bob, such that Bob knows this file is sent from Alice. Then Alice can use digital signature in this application. And Alice signed on the file. By sign on the file, it means Alice encrypt the file with Alice's private key. Then Bob will be able to verify the signature with Alice's public key, which is known to Bob or like to anyone. This is the idea of digital signature. And for public key, there's some drawback in its performance. And it's as you see, it's 1,000 times slower than symmetric cryptography. Here I can skip this. There are some security requirements on public key encryption. We already mentioned there's a pair of keys. And for encryption, it's quite similar as a symmetric cryptography or block ciphers. We have E here stands for encryption. Then we take a message M as input and the public key as the key, and encrypt gives the ciphertext. And for decryption, we have a decryption algorithm, and it takes the private key and the ciphertext as input. Then the output should be the same as the original message M. This is the assumption or the requirement on it. And of course, if the private key is incorrect, then this operation will not give out the same message as its output. So in most of cases, the output should be unrecognizable. And to repeat what I have described for secrecy, like we have a plain text, and here, suppose the sender is Alice and the receiver is Bob. So Bob has a pair of keys. There's a public key of Bob, private key of Bob. And Alice used Bob's public key to encrypt this message, this plain text, with an encryption. Then the ciphertext will be sent to Bob, and Bob uses its private key and a decryption algorithm to operate on this ciphertext. Ideally, the output of this decryption algorithm should be the original message if everything works fine. This is, in this case, you see the ciphertext cannot be decrypted by others and cannot be seen, cannot be readable by others. So this is how we can protect the confidentiality of the message M here. Another is authentication. By authentication here, we again use Alice as a sender, Bob as a receiver. So Bob wants to make sure the message he receives is exactly from Alice. Now in this case, Alice encrypts M with its private key. And the Alice public key is known to everyone, including Bob. So then Alice sends the ciphertext to Bob. Bob takes it as input, and together with Alice's public key, then decrypt it, get the original message M here. And if the message is indeed sent from Alice, then since Bob used Alice's public key, Bob should be able to recover the original message M. But if the message was not sent from Alice, then using Alice's public key will not give out a recognizable plain text. So this is the authentication process of public key cryptography. These two figures are the core part of public key cryptography. And here we can skip the these applications. Let me see. Yeah, this applications is kind of recap of the previous figure. One is in secrecy. So it's for confidentiality. And the sender encrypt the message with the receiver's public key. And another is called digital signature. It's by sign on a message. So Alice encrypted the message with Alice's private key and then send the output to the recipient, Bob. There's two ways of using public key crypto systems. And this here is a requirement of public key cryptography. And it's the first three is about the performance of public key cryptography. We would like to have efficient computation in the key generation, like we can easily generate the public key and the private keys. And we would like to have very efficient encryption process and a very efficient of decryption process. For security requirements, like if an attacker knows the public key, and it should be very difficult for the attacker to determine the private key. If the attacker knows the public key and the ciphertext, again, it should